Chapter 1. Force and Signification. It might be that we are all tattooed savages and sophocles, but there is more to art than the straightness of lines and the perfection of surfaces. Plasticity of style is not as large as the entire idea. We have too many things and not enough forms. Lover, preface a la vida escribió. If it recedes one day, leaving behind its work, and signs on the shore of our civilization, the structuralist invasion might become a question for the historian of ideas, or perhaps even an object. But the historian would be deceived if he came to this pass. By the very act of considering the structuralist invasion as an object, he would forget its meaning, and would forget that what is at stake, first of all, is an adventure of vision, a conversion of the way of putting questions to any object posed before us, to historical objects, his own in particular, and unexpectedly among these, the literary object. By way of analogy, the fact that universal thought, in all its domains, by all its pathways, and despite all differences, should be receiving a formidable impulse from an anxiety about language, which can only be an anxiety of language within language itself, is a strangely concerted development, and it is the nature of this development not to be able to display itself in its entirety as a spectacle for the historian if, by chance, he were to attempt to recognize in it the sign of an epoch, the fashion of a season, or the symptom of a crisis. Whatever the poverty of our knowledge in this respect, it is certain that the question of the sign is itself, more or less, or in any event, something other than a sign of the times. To dream of reducing it to a sign of the times is to dream of violence, especially when this question, an unexpectedly historical one, approaches the point at which the simple, significative nature of language appears rather uncertain, partial, or inessential. It will be granted readily that the analogy between the structuralist obsession and the anxiety of language is not a chance one. Therefore, it will never be possible, through some second or third-hand reflection, to make the structuralism of the 20th century, and particularly the structuralism of literary criticism which has eagerly joined the trend, undertake the mission that a structuralist critic has assigned to himself for the 19th century, to contribute to a future history of imagination and affectivity. Nor will it be possible to reduce the fascination inherent in the notion of structure to a phenomenon of fashion, except by reconsidering and taking seriously the meanings of imagination, affectivity, and fashion, doubtless the more urgent task. In any event, if some aspect of structuralism belongs to the domains of imagination, affectivity, or fashion, in the popular sense of these words, this aspect will never be the essential one. The structuralist stance, as well as our own attitudes assumed before or within language, are not only moments of history, they are an astonishment rather by language as the origin of history, by historicity itself, and also when confronted by the possibility of speech and always already within it, the finally acknowledged repetition of a surprise finally extended to the dimensions of world culture, a surprise incomparable to any other, a surprise responsible for the activation of what is called Western thought, the thought whose destiny is to extend its domains while the boundaries of the West are drawn back. By virtue of its innermost intention, and like all questions about language, structuralism escapes the classical history, and like all questions about language, structuralism of ideas which already supposes structuralism's possibility. For the latter naively belongs to the province of language and propounds itself within it. Nevertheless, by virtue of an irreducible region of irreflection and spontaneity within it, by virtue of the essential shadow of the undeclared, the structuralist phenomenon will deserve examination by the historian of ideas, for better or for worse. Everything within this phenomenon that does not in itself transparently belong to the question of the sign will merit this scrutiny, as will everything within it that is methodologically effective, thereby possessing the kind of infallibility now ascribed to sleepwalkers and formerly attributed to instinct, which was said to be as certain as it was blind. It is not a lesser province of the social science called history to have a privileged concern in the acts and institutions of man with the immense region of somnambulism, that almost everything which is not the pure waking state, the sterile and silent acidity of the question itself, the almost nothing. Since we take nourishment from the fecundity of structuralism, it is too soon to dispel our dream. We must muse upon what it might signify from within it. In the future it will be interpreted, perhaps as a relaxation, if not a lapse, of the attention given to force, which is the tension of force itself. Form fascinates when one no longer has the force to understand force from within itself. That is, to create. This is why literary criticism is structuralist in every age, in its essence and destiny. Criticism has not always known this, but understands it now, and thus is in the process of thinking itself in its own concept, system, and method. Criticism henceforth knows itself separated from force, occasionally avenging itself on force by gravely and profoundly proving that separation is the condition of the work, and not only of the discourse on the work. Thus is explained the low note, the melancholy pathos, that can be perceived behind the triumphant cries of technical ingenuity or mathematical subtlety that sometimes accompanies certain so-called structural analyses. Like melancholy for guide, these analyses are possible only after a certain defeat of force and within the movement of diminished ardor, which makes the structural consciousness in general, as a conceptualization of the past. I mean, of facts in general. A reflection of the accomplished, the constituted, the constructed, historical, eschatological, and crepuscular by its very situation. But within structure there is not only form, relation, and configuration. There is also interdependency and a totality which is always concrete. In literary criticism, the structural perspective is, according to Jean-Pierre Richard's expression, interrogative and totalitarian. The force of our weakness is that impotence separates, disengages, and emancipates. Henceforth, the totality is more clearly perceived. The panorama and the panoramagram are possible. The panoramagram, the very image of the structuralist instrument, was invented in 1824, as Leitra states, in order to obtain immediately, on a flat surface, the development of depth vision of objects on the horizon. Thanks to a more or less openly acknowledged schematization and spatialization, one can glance over the field divested of its forces more freely or diagrammatically. Or one can glance over the totality divested of its forces, even if it is a totality of form and meaning, for what is in question in this case is meaning rethought as form. And meaning, for what is in question in this case, is meaning rethought as form. And structure is the formal unity of form and meaning. It will be said that this neutralization of meaning by form is the author's responsibility before being the critic's, and to a certain extent, but it is just this extent which is in question. This is correct. In any event, the project of a conceptualization of totality is more easily stated today, and such a project in and of itself escapes the determined totalities of classical history, for it is the project of exceeding them. Thus the relief and design of structures appears more clearly when content, which is the living energy of meaning, is neutralized. Somewhat like the architecture of an uninhabited or deserted city, reduced to its skeletons by some catastrophe of nature or art. A city no longer inhabited, not simply left behind, but haunted by meaning and culture. This state of being haunted, which keeps the city from returning to nature, is perhaps the general mode of the presence or absence of the thing itself in pure language. The pure language that would be housed in pure literature, the object of pure literary criticism. Thus, it is in no way paradoxical that the structuralist consciousness is a catastrophic consciousness, simultaneously destroyed and destructive, destructuring, as in all consciousness, or at least the moment of decadence, which is the period proper to all movement of consciousness. Structure is perceived through the incidence of menace. At the moment when imminent danger concentrates our vision on the keystone of an institution, the stone which encapsulates both the possibility and the fragility of its existence. Structure then can be methodically threatened in order to become comprehended more clearly and to reveal not only its supports, but also that secret place in which it is neither construction nor ruin, but lability. This operation is called from the Latin soliciting. In other words, shaking, in a way related to the whole from solus, in archaic Latin, the whole, and from citar, to put in motion. The structuralist solicitude and solicitation give themselves only the illusion of technical liberty when they become methodical. In truth, they reproduce, in the register of method, a solicitude and solicitation of being, a historical metaphysical threatening of foundations. It is during the epoch of historical dislocation, when we are expelled from the sight, that this structuralist passion, which is simultaneously a frenzy of experimentation and a proliferation of schematizations, develops for itself. The Baroque would only be one example of it. Has not a structural poetics founded on a rhetoric been mentioned in relation to the Baroque? But has not a burst structure also been spoken of, a rent poem whose structure appears as it bursts apart? The liberty that this critical in all the senses of this word, disengagement, assures us of, therefore, is a solicitude for and an opening into totality. But what does this opening hide? And hide not by virtue of what it leaves aside and out of sight, but by virtue of its very power to illuminate. One continually asks oneself this question in reading Jean Rousseau's fine book, Forme et Signification, Essai sur la structure littéraire de Corneille à Claude. Our question is not a reaction against what others have called ingenuity, and what seems to us, except in a few instances, to be something more and something better. Confronted by this series of brilliant and penetrating exercises intended to illustrate a method, it is rather a question of unburdening ourselves of a mute anxiety, and of doing so at the point at which this anxiety is not only ours, the reader's, but also seems to conform, beneath the language, operations, and greater achievements of this book, to the anxiety of the author himself. Rousseau certainly acknowledges kinships and affiliations, Bachelard, Pouillet, Raymond, Picon, Stravinsky, Richard, etc. However, despite the familial air, the many borrowings and numerous respectful acknowledgments forming Signification seems to us in many respects a solitary attempt. In the first place, this is due to a deliberate difference. Rousseau does not isolate himself within this difference, keeping his distance. Rather, he scrupulously examines a community of intentions by bringing to the surface enigmas hidden beneath values that are today accepted and respected. Modern values, they may be, but values already traditional enough to have the commonplaces of criticism, making them, therefore, open to reflection and suspicion. Rousseau presents his theses in a remarkable methodological introduction that, along with the introduction to L'Univers Imaginaire de Mallarmé, should become an important part of the discourse on method and literary criticism. In multiplying his introductory references, Rousseau does not muddle his discourse, but, on the contrary, weaves a net that tightens its originality. For example, that in the literary fact, language is one with meaning. That form belongs to the content of the work. That, according to the expression of Gaëtan Picon, for modern art, the work is not expression but creation. These are propositions that gain unanimous acceptance only by means of a highly equivocal propositions that gain notion of form or expression. The same goes for the notion of imagination, the power of mediation or synthesis between meaning and literality, the common root of the universal and the particular. As of all other similarly dissociated couples, the obscure origin of these structural frameworks and of the empathy between form and content, which makes possible both the work and the access to its unity. For Kant, the imagination was already in itself an art, was art itself, which originally did not distinguish between truth and beauty, and despite all the differences, Kant speaks of the same imagination in the Critique of Pure Reason, in the Critique of Judgment, as does Rousseau. It is art, certainly, but a hidden art that cannot be revealed to the eyes. Now, since the reduction of a representation of the imagination to concepts and equivalent to given its exponents, the aesthetic idea may be called an inexorable representation of the imagination in its free play. Imagination is the freedom that reveals itself only in its works. These works do not exist within nature, but neither do they inhabit a world other than ours. The imagination as a productive faculty of cognition is a powerful agent for creating, as it were, a second nature out of the material supplied to it by actual nature. This is why intelligence is not necessarily the essential faculty of the critic when he sets out to encounter imagination and beauty. And what we call beautiful, intelligence is at the service of the imagination, and the latter is not at the service of the intelligence. For the freedom of the imagination consists precisely in the fact that it schematizes without a concept. This enigmatic origin of the work as a structure and indissociable unity, and as an object for structuralist criticism, is, according to Kant, the first thing to which we must pay attention. According to Rousseau also. From his first page on, he links the nature of the literary fact, always insufficiently examined, to the role in art of imagination, that fundamental activity about which uncertainties and oppositions abound. This notion of an imagination that produces metaphor, that is, everything in language except verb to be, remains for critics what certain philosophers today call a naively utilized operative concept. To surmount this technical ingenuineness is to reflect the operative concept as a thematic concept. This seems to be one of Rousseau's projects. To grasp the operation of creative imagination at the greatest possible proximity to it, one must turn oneself toward the invisible interior of poetic freedom. One must be separated from oneself in order to be reunited with the blind origin of the work in its darkness. This experience of conversion, which founds the literary act, writing or reading, is such that the very words separation and exile, which always designate the interiority of a breaking off with the world and a making of one's way within it, cannot directly manifest the experience. They can only indicate it through a metaphor whose genealogy itself would deserve all of our efforts. For in question here is a departure from the world toward a place which is neither a non-place nor an other world, neither a utopian nor an alibi, the creation of a universe to be added to the universe. According to an expression of Phocion cited by Rousseau, forme signification, this universe articulates only that which is in excess of everything, the essential nothing on whose basis everything can appear and be produced within language. And the voice of Maurice Blanchot reminds us, with the insistence of profundity, that this excess is the very possibility of writing and of literary inspiration in general. Only pure absence, not the absence of this or that, but the absence of everything in which all presence is announced, can inspire, in other words, can work, and then make one work. The pure book naturally turns toward the eastern edge of this absence, which, beyond or within the prodigiousness of all wealth, is its first and proper content, The pure book, the book itself, by virtue of what is most irreplaceable within it, must be the book about nothing, that Flaubert dreamed of, a grey, negative dream, the origin of the total book, that haunted other imaginations. This emptiness, as the situation of literature must acknowledge by the critic, as that which constitutes the specificity of his object, as that around which he always speaks, or rather his proper object, since nothing is not an object, is the way in which this nothing itself is determined by disappearing. It is the transition to the determination of the work as the disguising of its origin. But the origin is possible and conceivable only in disguise. Rousseau shows us the extent to which spirits as diverse as Delacroix, Balzac, Flaubert, Valery, as the Proust, T.S. Eliot, Virginia Woolf, and many others had a sure consciousness of this. A sure and certain consciousness, although in principle not a clear and distinct one, as there is not intuition of a thing involved. To these voices should be added that of Antonin Artaud, who was less roundabout. I made my debut in literature by writing books in order to say that I could write nothing at all. My thoughts, when I had something to say or write, were that which was furthest from me. I never had any ideas, and 2 short books, even, each 70 pages long, are about this profound, inveterate, endemic absence of any idea. These books are Lambic de Lin and Les Pesners. The consciousness of having something to say is the consciousness of nothing. This is not the poorest, but the most oppressed of consciousnesses. It is the consciousness of nothing upon which all consciousness of something enriches itself, takes on meaning and shape, and upon whose basis all speech can be brought forth. For the thought of the thing as what it is has already been confused with the experience of pure speech, and this experience has been confused with experience itself. Now does not pure speech require inscription, somewhat in the manner that the Libysian essence requires existence and pushes on toward the world, like power toward the act? If the anguish of writing is not, and must not, be a determined pathos, it is because this anguish is not an empirical modification or state of the writer, but is the responsibility of angustia, the necessarily restricted passageway of speech against which is all possible meanings push each other, preventing each other's emergences, preventing but calling upon each other, provoking each other too, unforeseeably and if despite oneself, in a kind of autonomous overassemblage of meanings, a power of pure equivocality that makes the creativity of the classical God appear all too poor. Speaking frightens me because by never saying enough I also say too much. And if the necessity of becoming breath or saying enough or speech restricts meaning and our responsibility for it, writing restricts and constrains speech further still. Writing is the anguish of the Hebraic ruah, experienced in solitude by human responsibility, experienced by Jeremiah, subjected to God's dictation. Take thee a roll of the book, and write therein all the words that I have spoken unto thee, or by Baruch transcribing Jeremiah's dictation. Jeremiah 36, 2-4. Or further, within the properly human moment of pneumatology, the science of pneuma, spiritus, or logos, which was divided into 3 parts, the divine, the angelical, and the human. It is the moment at which we must decide whether we will engrave what we hear, and whether engraving preserves or betrays speech. God, the God of Leibniz, since we have just spoken of him, did not know the anguish of the choice between various possibilities. He of him did not know he conceived possible choices in an action, and disposed of them as such in the understanding or logos, and in any event the narrowness of a passageway, that is will, favors the best choice. And each existence continues to express the totality of the universe. There is therefore no tragedy of the book. There is only one book, and the same book is distributed throughout all books. In the Theodicy, Theodorus, who had become able to confront the divine radiancy of the daughter of Jupiter, is led by her to the palace of the Fates. In this palace, Jupiter, having surveyed them before the beginning of the existing world, classified the having classified the possibilities into worlds and chose the best of all. He comes sometimes to visit these places, to enjoy the pleasure of recapitulating things and of renewing his own choice, which cannot fail to please him. After being told all this by Pallas, Theodorus is led into a hall which was a world. There was a great volume of writings in this hall. Theodorus could not refrain from asking what that meant. It is the history of this world which we are now visiting. The goddess told him, it is the book of its fates. You have seen a number on the forehead of Sextus. Look in this book for the place which it indicates. Theodorus looked for it and found there the history of Sextus in a form more ample than the outline he had seen. Put your finger on any line you please, Pallas said to him, and you will see represented actually in all its detail that which is the line broadly indicates. He obeyed, and he saw coming into view all the characteristics of a portion of the life of God Sextus.